Welcome to the 30th episode of the second season of The Pulpiteer. I'm your host, Eric Hepburn, and I'm glad to have you join us for today's episode. Today's episode is called Set Them Free. It is my reflections on how to approach ministry in both youth and adult contexts from a perspective that values and honors diversity and pluralism deeply. If you feel like it, you can pause and pull up the Sting song, If You Love Somebody, Set Them Free, which is my heart anthem for this service. Okay, let's begin with our Great World House segment and then the Word of Wisdom, delivered this week by Woody Hibbard. Pause to honor this great world house of which we are a part, lifting up the needs, the hopes, and the voices beyond these doors. Here we are, in the shadow of Easter and Passover, Ramadan and spring equinox. There is much and more going on in the world out there. Some of the members of those religions are using them as pretenses for dehumanizing and committing acts of unspeakable violence and destruction against each other. So much of what's going on is frightening and disheartening. Yet, the earth keeps spinning. And here in this deep season of spring, we get back new images of earth as she appears rising over the lunar surface, reminding us of home. So we've got a lot of religions all celebrating spring in their particular way and all honoring that which feels universal to those of us who call this planet home. Spring has come again with her new life, her new possibilities, and the invitation to shuck off old habits that no longer serve. Amen.
Let's enter a still place within, opening our hearts and minds to receive this voice of wisdom. After the words are spoken, we will breathe together in silence, preparing ourselves for the word unfolding among us. Today's voice of wisdom comes from Paulo Freire's book, The Pedagogy of Freedom. Respect for the autonomy and dignity of every person is an ethical imperative and not a favor that we may or may not concede to each other. My respect as a teacher for the student, for their curiosities and fears, demands of me the cultivation of humility and tolerance. How can I respect the curiosity of the students if, lacking genuine humility and an understanding of the role of the unknown in the process of reaching the known, I am afraid of revealing my own ignorance? How can I consider myself to be an educator, especially in the context of open-minded and enlightened teaching practice, if I cannot learn to live with what is different? How can I be an educator if I do not develop within myself a caring and loving attitude toward the student?
If you love someone, set them free. Like all deep wisdom and good advice, it's easy to say and incredibly difficult to practice. I've wanted to preach this sermon for a while, but it didn't really crystallize for me, as I said, until I was in this interview with our new RE guide, Jessica and Candace. And I was trying to explain to someone who didn't have a lot of experience with Unitarian Universalists or Unitarian Universalism what it was that we're trying to do here that's different than what they might have experienced in other church settings, but also, I would argue, different than what is happening perhaps in the mainstream of Unitarian Universalist practice. So let me address that last part first just a little bit. What is, in my opinion, happening in the mainstream of Unitarian Universalist practice is what we could describe as an exercise of conventional wisdom. In other words, this is how we've always done church. This is how church ought to be done. So we are following the forms. Now, you might notice from my tone of voice that when I attach the word conventional to the word wisdom, I often suggesting that the latter part of the construction is lost under the weight of the first part. That your honoring of convention sometimes becomes a dogmatic practice that cuts you off from seeing the wisdom that needs to emerge from a real moment or from changing circumstance. And I think that is the case here. So, Unitarian Universalism in the mainstream is doing what I think most Christian denominations do, which is they treat religious education as a process of indoctrination. We are going to teach you to think like we think and to be carbon copies of what we think is right. We're going to form you. The word formation is commonly used in religious contexts for this purpose. My objection to the term formation is it thinks it already knows how you should end up. I'm not sure that we're that good yet, that we know how people should end up. So, a lot of the emphasis is on, developing in our children a UU identity. We want them to identify as UUs. And for me, this is simply an echo of the way that Christian denominations function in our culture, which is, like I said, it's indoctrination. I want you to grow up in internalizing our community identity as one of your core identities so that you will never question it. And so that when you move on in life, you will stay devout to our sect. Now, I think you can tell by the way I'm speaking of this that I don't think that this actually, as a strategy, aligns with UU theological commitments to open-heartedness, open-mindedness, etc. And so in this conversation where I was trying to explain to Jessica that indoctrination was not our goal, I was forced to answer the question, if not, then what? If our goal is not to indoctrinate good little UUs, and I would argue from my own life experience, we have seen in both the Christian sects and the UU sects that deep indoctrination doesn't tend to work. It doesn't tend to create loyal brand advocates. It tends to create people who, once they break out into the freedom of college and the afterlife, tend to be like, yeah, I don't know. That was kind of a mess. I think not. So, the reading we did this morning was Paulo Freire. He has a different take on what education is supposed to be. It's not about indoctrination. It means trusting someone enough for them to develop their own criteria. So here's the story, the thing that came out in this meeting that when I said it out loud, I knew I was ready to preach this sermon. And it sounded like this. Here's what I want for any youth that go through our program. I want them to be kids on the daily who on Sunday morning wake up and are like, yes, I want to go. I want to go. Not just like school and everything else in my life is another thing I'm made to do. That fundamentally shifts how we do RE here compared to how it's done other places. Because there are a lot of places where it's just another day at school for kids. And it's another set of grown-ups trying to say, this is what you should do, this is how you should be, here's what compliance looks like. And we're not doing that here. Like, that is explicitly not what we're building. I've preached from this pulpit that play is the most natural form of learning. And that's what we practice here. We practice here that play and exploration and relationship navigation is where we learn the deep lessons. But here's my aspiration for these kids. If these kids want to come here and they come here, at some point they're going to grow up. And they're going to go off and have a job or a marriage or a career or a college or a whatever they're going to do. And they're going to fly the coop. And when they land in some new town, here's what I want for them. I don't want them to search the nearest UU congregation and just by default go there. And that is a certain kind of heresy. Now, I would be deeply troubled about my own performance if they didn't give the UU church in that location a shot. I'd feel like I had failed on some level if they didn't give the UU church a shot. But what I want them to do is develop the skills while they're here, that wherever they land, they can go visit a couple different churches and they have the skills and the awareness and the presence to notice which one of those places is the right place for their next phase of spiritual development. That's what I care about. That's what I want for each one of those little creatures over there to get out of what we do, is the ability to show up in a place and detect whether that place is spiritually alive and nurturing for them. What does diversity mean? It means we don't all need the same thing. So I can't teach them a formula for like, oh, here's the checklist for a good church. It doesn't work like that. But if I can teach them how to pay attention to their own body and their own feeling and their own thoughts and to cultivate their own spirit, they can show up and be like, this is where I'm supposed to be. Not forever. Not because its identity politics line up with mine, but because I can sense that this is the place that my spirit needs to be fed and will be fed. This is a space where I can be courageous and brave. It's a space safe enough for that. There are people here willing to hold space for me so I don't always have to be strong, the strong one. I don't always have to have my armor on. Maybe when I pull up in the parking lot, I can take the armor that I usually have to wear to work and in other places to keep me safe, and I can take that armor off and leave it in the car and walk into a sanctuary. Walk into a sanctuary. Because I know that you know this from your own life experience, or at least most of you do. Not every sanctuary is a sanctuary. There are some places that call themselves that are deep residuals and perpetuators of trauma. And I hate to say it out loud, and yes, there are some UU churches that fit that description. There is no denomination. There's no religion that is free from this. Not every Buddhist temple or Sangha it doesn't matter what religion it is. It doesn't matter what religion it is. They're not all equally spiritually healthy. And because we're all weird and individual and unique, their way of doing spirit and worship stuff doesn't always mesh with what we need or how we do that work or the phase in our own development that we're at. And in having this meeting and articulating this to our new RE guide, I realized that It's the exact same way that I feel about grown-up church. If you're a visitor and you walk in that door, yes, I am hoping that the way that we do this resonates for you, and you have just walked in and had your first day finding a new spiritual home. But let me be really clear. I am not hoping that because I need one more number in my membership book. I'm hoping that for them. I'm hoping that for you because I believe everybody deserves that. Everybody deserves to have that spiritual home. Everybody deserves to have a place in their life that is that true sanctuary. And we are not the right fit for every human being in Georgetown. We're not better than every other religious community out there. We are a flavor. That's it. We're a flavor. Now, I hope we're a deep flavor, so that if you've got your, is this a healthy place that can support me spiritually, radar turned in, the answer to that question is yes, and you can move on to the, is it the right fit for me question. Because the litmus test first should be, is this place spiritually healthy? The second one is it a good fit for me and where I'm at on my life journey and my favorite symbols for manipulating and understanding this? There are some folks who really love biblical Christian symbology, and there are some folks who really love and are uniquely drawn to Buddhist symbology or Hindu symbology. Like, that's all good. If you go to a spiritually healthy place that also happens to speak the same language you speak so that you don't have to translate, that's fantastic. You deserve that. I want that for you. If this place is that place for you, hallelujah, welcome. If it's not, I don't need you to stay here. I don't want you to stay here. I want you to go find what you deserve. I want you to go find a place that can be a spiritual home for you, where they speak a language that sounds like music to your ears, that resonates with the deepest longings of your heart. That's what you deserve. That's what our kids deserve. And that's what we want to build here at St. Gabriel UU. And that's why we're the heretic's heretic, if you will. Got to keep it heretical. You know, there's a reason that they almost always call prophets heretics. They like to say things that are uncomfortable to the idea that we might turn this into some sort of assembly line, which is another way of me circling back to the education problem and Paulo Freire. So, the traditional educational model in this country, developed in the pre- and post-war years, developed as a result of industrialization, was one size fits all. If you can conform as a young person to the expectations of the system, we will pass you through, and then you can go out and get a job, and you will have normalized certain types of behavioral exploitation, which we appreciate. Now, in ways that do not surprise me, our congregation attracts a wide variety of neurodiverse folks. Now, on the one hand, you could say, that's weird. Why do they attract those people? On the other hand, you could say, if other places are running on this conventional model where your job is to fit in, not to belong, if you want more distinction on that, you can go read some of Brene Brown's writings on fitting in versus belonging. Fitting in is conforming to somebody else's stuff at the cost of your own integrity. Belonging is being able to show up as you are and be loved and accepted. That's what we want here. You show up as you are and are loved and accepted. And we accept that within you is a natural desire to learn and grow. In the same way that we all get stuck in life, that natural desire is also to figure out how to get unstuck when we get stuck. And get unstuck so we can keep moving and growing and flowing. Some of us who grew up with wise elders do that work so that we can honor those teachers in our life, so that we can become the wise elders for others that we experienced. Some of us who had a dearth of wise elders in our lives are trying to figure out how to become wise elders because we know that our kids deserve better than we got. Whatever your motivation, that natural desire to do it and to grow into something beautiful and complex that is a source of fecundity for your community is a natural desire. One that sometimes our egos tell us is not possible. Sometimes one that culture would like you to believe that is a fool's errand to spend your time doing that. Why don't you just get comfortable? Put on your blinders and make some money at somebody else's expense so that you can have your creature comforts. I'll try not to turn this into a sermon on the invisible hand as a substitute for God. But it's an interesting line of thought for those Adam Smith scholars in the room. So we talked a little bit about this church trap. When a church comes to this work from a place of scarcity, it gets concerned with attracting numbers, keeping people in the pews, that kind of thing. That corrupts everything downstream. It turns religious education into denominational catechism. It turns hospitality into recruitment. It makes growth mean butts in seats rather than spiritual maturity. That's the big one for me. Butts in seats rather than spiritual maturity. I'd rather have a congregation of 5 really on the path than a congregation of 500 and nobody can find their way. UU congregations aren't immune to domestication just because we don't have a creed. Often we've replaced doctrinal conformity with cultural conformity, and the effect is the same. People learn to fit in rather than learning how to discern. And so this Sting song is about that. If you love someone, set them free. What I love about it is it also keeps us honest. Because there is a narrative in church world out there that goes something like this. You do all this indoctrination work and you indoctrinate the kids and then they leave and they don't come back. Maybe we should indoctrinate them harder. When the truth is, if we teach them to sense spiritual aliveness and healthiness of community and relationship better and deeper than we did, they become the litmus test for whether we're living our own values. And then when they don't come back, or if they don't come back, instead of blaming them, we can look at ourselves and ask, are we practicing as deeply as we need to? If they can't find home here as an adult, it might not be their failing. It might be ours, and not our failing in the past to stick the burrs of identity deeper into their being, but our failure in the present to be spiritually alive enough for them to get something out of showing up. Can you tell the difference between a community that performs welcome and one that practices? Can you sense when a community's theology serves the people versus serving the institution? As a spiritual seeker, do you know what your own non-negotiables are? What is it that a spiritual home must have for you to grow there? Can you recognize when a community is asking you to shrink rather than expand? These are learnable skills. We don't teach them because teaching them means admitting that we might not pass the test. Freire again, how can I respect the curiosity of the students if I am afraid of revealing my own ignorance? The congregation that teaches discernment has to be willing to be discerned about it. That's not only vulnerability, but integrity. Here's the institutional survival logic, can't compute. Communities that hold on tightest lose the most people. And communities that genuinely say, we want you to find what's right for you, even if it's not us, are the ones people trust enough to stay in. This is basic relational psychology and basic theology. Grasping kills. Open hands receive. So what do we as a spiritual community do with this? What if our RE program explicitly included how to evaluate a spiritual community as a set of classes and practices and skills? As a learning objective for all ages? What if we told our young people, we're going to teach you what a healthy congregation looks like, and we're going to be honest that we don't always get it right? What if we told visiting adults, we don't want you to join because we're UU, we want you to join because this specific community serves your spiritual growth, and we want you to keep asking questions even after you join? That's a radically different posture. It's also, frankly, what covenant means. So covenant is a core of UU, and it says that the community is made by the promises we make one another that we are willing to keep. And a promise like that can only mean something when people are truly free to walk away. That freedom to walk away, the commitment to expressing that freedom, is what makes covenant sacred. Amen. Until next time, thank you for joining us on The Pulpiteer. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help others find it by liking and subscribing. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can make a donation at sangabrieluu.org/give. The Pulpiteer podcast is a production of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Georgetown, Texas. The podcast is hosted by Spotify, and theme music is by John Faber. Our live recording tech crew this week was Frank Sanders, Rob Berthold, Keith Hutchinson, and Andrea McDaniel. The podcast is produced and performed by Eric Hepburn. See you soon.